Introduction to chemical handling in the laboratory. Chemical handling refers to the safe and efficient management of chemicals in various settings such as laboratories, industrial facilities, and households. Proper handling of chemicals is important to minimize the potential risks associated with them, including physical hazards, flammability, explosiveness, reactivity, and health hazards such as toxicity, irritancy, carcinogenicity. To ensure the safety of individuals in the community, it is crucial to follow safe chemical handling procedures, which include using personal protective equipment, PPE, such as gloves, goggles, and protective clothing, reading labels and material safety data sheets, MSDS, and properly storing and disposing of chemicals. In addition, good laboratory practices, such as keeping the laboratory clean and organized, following proper waste disposal procedures, and knowing the location of emergency equipment, are important to promote laboratory safety. Chemical handling is a critical aspect of chemical management that requires a high degree of attention and caution. By following safe chemical handling practices, individuals can reduce the risks associated with chemical exposure and promote a safe and healthy environment. Brief overview of chemical handling. Here's an overview of chemical handling. Chemical handling refers to the safe and efficient management of chemicals in various settings such as laboratories, industrial facilities, and households. Proper handling of chemicals is important to minimize the potential risks associated with them, including physical hazards, flammability, explosiveness, reactivity, and health hazards, toxicity, irritancy, carcinogenicity. To ensure the safety of individuals in the community, it is crucial to follow safe chemical handling procedures, which include the use of personal protective equipment, PPE, such as gloves, goggles, and protective clothing. Reading of labels and material safety data sheets, MSDS. Proper storage and disposal of chemicals. Good laboratory practices, such as keeping the laboratory clean and organized, following proper waste disposal procedures, and knowing the location of emergency equipment, are important to promote laboratory safety. Importance of safe chemical handling. Chemical handling is essential to promote awareness to the whole organization as well as prevention from the hazards and risks associated with exposure to chemicals. Number 1 importance is to minimize the risks associated with chemical exposure. Proper handling of chemicals reduces the risk of physical hazards, flammability, explosiveness, reactivity, and health hazards, toxicity, irritancy, carcinogenicity. Second, to promote the safety of individuals and the community. Safe chemical handling practices help to ensure that individuals in the surrounding community are protected from the potential dangers of chemical exposure. Third, to comply with regulatory requirements such as safe chemical handling procedures are necessary to comply with regulatory requirements set by organizations such as the Environmental Management Bureau, EMB, and the Bureau of Working Conditions of the Department of Labor and Employment, BWC-DOLE. Fourth, to protecting the environment through proper storage and disposal of chemicals helps to prevent environmental contamination and protect natural resources. Lastly, to maintain a safe workplace. A safe and organized laboratory or workplace promotes a positive work environment and helps to minimize the risk of accidents and injuries. Hazards associated with chemicals. Chemicals can pose various hazards, including toxicity. Some chemicals can be poisonous if ingested, inhaled, or come into contact with skin or eyes. Flammability. Some chemicals can ignite or explode easily. Reactivity. Some chemicals can react with other substances to release energy or form hazardous products. Corrosiveness. Some chemicals can damage materials or cause burns to skin and eyes. Environmental hazards. Chemicals can leach into soil and water and harm plants, animals, and ecosystems. Carcinogenicity. Some chemicals are known to cause cancer. Irritation. Some chemicals can cause skin, eye, and respiratory irritation. It's important to handle chemicals safely and follow appropriate safety procedures to minimize the risk of exposure and associated hazards. Good laboratory practices, GLP. Good laboratory practices, GLP, are a set of guidelines that ensure the quality, safety, and integrity of laboratory experiments and research studies involving chemicals. The following are some of the key principles of GLP. Standard operating procedures, SOPs. Well-defined procedures for handling and testing chemicals should be in place to minimize the risk of error and contamination. Quality control. Routine checks should be carried out to ensure the accuracy and reliability of laboratory equipment, reagents, and results. Training. Laboratory staff should be properly trained in the safe handling and use of chemicals, as well as in GLP principles. Record keeping. Detailed records should be maintained of all experiments, including raw data, observations, and calculations. Equipment maintenance. Laboratory equipment should be regularly inspected and maintained to ensure it is functioning correctly. Safety. Appropriate safety equipment and procedures should be in place to minimize the risk of exposure to hazardous chemicals. Quality assurance. A quality assurance program should be in place to regularly monitor compliance with GLP principles and ensure the reliability and validity of results. Adherence to GLP principles is critical in ensuring the quality and integrity of research studies involving chemicals, and promoting the safe handling of chemicals in the laboratory. Best practices for chemical storage. Here are some best practices for handling chemicals in the laboratory. Know the properties and hazards of the chemicals you are using. Consult safety datasheets, SDS, and other reference materials to understand the properties and hazards of the chemicals you are handling. Use appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE, wear gloves, goggles, lab coat, and other PPE as necessary to protect yourself from exposure to hazardous chemicals. Label containers clearly. Label all chemical containers with the chemical name, concentration, and date of preparation. Store chemicals safely in a designated area away from heat sources, and in appropriate containers, such as flammable storage cabinets for flammable liquids. Use proper technique for transferring chemicals, such as the use of a pipette or other appropriate equipment to transfer chemicals, and avoid splashing or spilling. Follow standard operating procedures, SOPs, for handling and using chemicals, and follow proper disposal procedures for waste. Be aware of spills and accidents. Have spill kits readily available and know how to respond in case of a spill or accident. Keep a clean and organized work area. Minimize contamination and reduce the risk of accidents by keeping a clean and organized work area. By following these best practices, you can help to ensure the safe handling of chemicals in the laboratory and minimize the risk of exposure and injury. Personal protective equipment, PPE, for handling chemicals in the laboratory. The appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE, for handling chemicals in the laboratory depends on the type of chemical and the nature of the work being performed. However, some common PPE used in handling chemicals include: gloves are used to protect hands from contact with hazardous chemicals. Goggles or face shield are used to protect eyes from splashes or sprays of chemicals. Lab coat or aprons are worn to protect clothing and skin from contact with chemicals. Respirators or masks to protect lungs from inhaling hazardous fumes or dust. Appropriate footwear are worn to protect feet from spills and splashes of chemicals. Lastly, wearing of ear protection to protect ears from loud noises or excessive noise. The type and level of PPE required depends on the specific chemical and the potential for exposure, and it's important to consult the Material Safety Datasheet, MSDS, and other reference materials to determine the appropriate PPE. It's also important to properly maintain and dispose of PPE to ensure its effectiveness in protecting against chemical exposure. Fire safety and emergency response. When handling chemicals in the laboratory, it's important to be prepared for potential emergencies such as fires, spills, injuries, and explosions. Here are some recommended fire safety and emergency response measures. Evacuation plan. Have a well-defined evacuation plan in place and make sure all laboratory staff are familiar with it. Fire suppression equipment. Have fire suppression equipment such as fire extinguishers readily available and know how to use them. Spill response kit. Have a spill response kit readily available to contain and clean up spills. First aid supplies. Have basic first aid supplies readily available, including eye wash and emergency shower, to treat minor injuries. Emergency contact information. Have emergency contact information readily available, such as the number for the local fire department and poison control center. Reporting procedures. Establish procedures for reporting accidents, spills, and injuries to the appropriate authorities. Training. Provide training for laboratory staff on fire safety, spill response, and emergency procedures. In case of an emergency, it's important to evacuate the laboratory immediately and follow established procedures for reporting the incident and responding to the emergency. By being prepared and following established procedures, you can minimize the risk of injury and damage in case of an emergency. In conclusion, knowledge of properties and hazards. Familiarize yourself with the properties and hazards of the chemicals you are handling. The use of appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE, such as gloves, goggles, lab coats, and respirators to protect yourself from exposure to hazardous chemicals. Safe storage and labeling. Store chemicals in designated areas, label containers clearly, and follow proper disposal procedures for waste. Follow established standard operating procedures, SOPs, for handling and using chemicals to minimize the risk of error and contamination. Have a well-defined evacuation plan and emergency response procedures in place, and make sure all laboratory staff are familiar with them. provide comprehensive training for laboratory staff on the safe handling of chemicals, fire safety, spill response, and emergency procedures. By following these key points, you can help to ensure the safe handling of chemicals in the laboratory and minimize the risk of exposure and injury. In closing, the importance of safe handling of chemicals in the laboratory should be emphasized. By being knowledgeable about the properties, hazards and risks of the chemicals usually handled in the laboratory, using appropriate PPE and following established standard operating procedures and emergency response procedures, a safe and secure laboratory environment is ensured. Here's hoping that this video has provided you with valuable information and insights into the best practices for chemical handling in the laboratory. If you have further questions or would like to discuss the topics covered in more details, don't hesitate to reach out to Enger Ramir El Jarabis at room number 521, Physics and Chemistry Laboratories, University of San Jose Recoletos, Main Campus, Magallanes Street, Cebu City. Thank you for your attention and have a great day.